Hello and welcome to today's webinar on fraud in public fundraising. My name is Peter Hills-Jones. I'm the Director of Compliance at the Institute of Fundraising. We're one of the partner organisations for the Charity Fraud Awareness Week, and I'm very pleased to be talking to you today about a very important issue, but one that doesn't get as much coverage as perhaps it should do, which is fraud in public fundraising. So public fundraising, for the purposes of today's webinar, is predominantly direct debit fundraising conducted via street, door-to-door, private site or telephone fundraising, but I will be touching on a number of other areas including cash collections, lottery sales, prize promotions and clothing collections as well. But the majority of today's webinar will be covered on public fundraising via direct debit. So the main topics I'm going to be covering today are predominantly what types of fraud are we talking about. So within public fundraising, some of the areas I've already touched on around what specific measures we can also take to help counter fraud. I'm also going to be covering how widespread I think the problem is and what we can potentially do to improve matters. So the first main type of fraud that I'm going to be talking about today is account fraud or misuse of facility. I'll then also be touching on either illegal and unlicensed clothing collections, peddlers and street traders selling items for charity, unlicensed cash collections and prize promotions and prize draws. So a wide range of different issues related to charity fraud. So public fundraisers, I mentioned, predominantly secure donations via regular direct debits. The primary target of this fraud, from what we have found from talking to our members, is not actually the public, but primarily the fundraiser's employer and by extension the charity that has commissioned the campaign. So just to give you an overview, around 70 to 75% of all public fundraising will be conducted by third-party agencies, and that work will be commissioned by charities, and the remainder is conducted by what we call in-house teams. So those are fundraisers who are directly employed by the charity. Now, the way in which we've seen some of this happen in recent years is that fundraisers will register what appear to be legitimate donors, i.e. a real person with an active bank account, but do so without their permission. These donors, in inverted commas, will then be processed as genuine donors, triggering payments to both the fundraiser and their company. So just to talk to you a little bit more about how that process works is that a significant amount of activity within public fundraising is based at least on a partial, if not full, payment incentive basis. So commission does play a significant part in performance-related pay for some fundraisers, but not all. But one of the issues that does tend to lead to, based on feedback that we've had from our members, is that when charity fundraisers move from company to company, what we have seen is that they can actually transfer some of the data. So we're working very closely with our members to make sure that they're making sure they're getting all their data security right. But some of the feedback we have had has shown that some individuals have been taking genuine information from one campaign, moving to another organisation and seeding some of the donors from previous campaigns and previous companies they've worked for into their new employer. What that does is that then triggers the payment to the fundraiser. The charity then views that sign up as a legitimate donor and then will pay the company as per their contract. Now, there are a number of different ways we can look to try and improve these areas, and one of the main things the charities and their agencies have brought in are modulus checks. Now, modulus checks are confirmed that the bank account number and sort code are valid and match. However, importantly, they do not cross-reference that data against the account holder's name. So just to give you an idea about the overall scale of what we're talking about here, based on information provided by BACS, we think around 108 million charity direct debits are currently active in 2016. And in reference to that, only 96,000 instances of misuse of facility across all sectors, according to the CIFAS data. So while we would not in any way seek to downplay the importance of account fraud and misuse or misuse of facility, as it's sometimes called, it is important to acknowledge that the overall impact on charities and agencies from having people working for them who are looking to abuse this particular loophole is quite significant. So one of the things, because modulus checks are not being used, or I should say, because modulus checks do not cross-reference the account name and sort code with the account name, is that what charities and agencies can do is look at a couple of different counter-fraud measures to help supplement their existing security systems. So this can include welcome calling or random sampling of signed-up donors, which can often highlight where fraud may have occurred. So a number of instances where fraud of this nature has been reported to charities has been from individuals noticing on their monthly statements that a new direct debit has been set up. They then contacted the charity and raised that this is an erroneous direct debit and should not be on the system, and further investigation from the charity and agency have highlighted what the problem has been. So what welcome calling and random sampling of signed up donors very shortly after they get uploaded onto the system can highlight is, before that happens, is that we can identify potentially patterns of fraud where individuals can be contacted in advance, but either before payments have been made from their account via direct debit, or very shortly, perhaps if they've only made one or perhaps two payments. Another check that charities and agencies can make is obviously regular, what we call deduping or deduplication of donor databases. So as I mentioned, one of the key sources that we think is emerging where some of this data is coming from is individuals taking data from one campaign at a previous organisation and transferring it across with themselves to a new campaign. Now, by deduping the information, what the charities can look at is whether or not these donors have potentially given to their charity beforehand. And if you're seeing kind of regular patterns of the same account numbers and the same sort codes coming up time and time again, is that further investigation could potentially reveal patterns of behaviour. But one of the most important ways, and this is something that BACS has been really supportive of, is really making sure that organisations, not just charities, but all organisations, are making sure that they're cross-referencing account names with account details as well. And they've released an updated service users guide and rules for the direct debit scheme in February 2017, which can be found on their website. And one of the things it really identifies is that it identifies methods for paperless sign-ups, which particularly for charity fundraisers, particularly those working on the street door-to-door and on private sites, so shopping centres, bus stations, train centres, etc., is that those organisations can validate the identity and the address of their payer, not only their contact details as well, to make sure that all those three contact points align with each other. And the guide identifies some helpful ways in which you can go about that, and does identify to members that failure to do so will result in an increased risk of fraud. So just to give you a kind of visual identification for the two potential ways in which this can happen. So on the left-hand side, you can see without verification. On the right-hand side, you can see with verification as well. So there are a number of different kind of software packages out there at the moment where with account verification can be added into systems. And while this obviously adds additional steps in terms of the processing time, certainly from our position at the Institute of Fundraising is we feel the potential risks to donors, while not huge, is certainly significant enough to warrant investment in with account verification measures being taken by members. So moving away from misuse of facility onto some other areas, illegal and unlicensed clothing collections has been an issue that has been around for quite a while, but what we are seeing is an increase in particularly unlicensed collections. Based on research that was conducted by one of our members, is that potentially over half of all bag collections in the UK may be either unlicensed or certainly illegitimate. And I'll talk about what the differences are between those two a little bit later on. So broadly, we believe that there are three categories of undesirable or illegitimate behaviour. So that would be real companies operating without a local licence. So local licences must be issued by either a local authority, or if the company is collecting on behalf of a charity with what's called a national exemption order, which is basically a national licence which is issued by the Office of Civil Society, which is now based within DCMS. That collection cannot take place. So either a local authority issued licence or a national licence from government. But those are real companies simply operating outside of the existing licensing regime. The other area that we've seen to have increased in recent years has been real companies, but they're taking bags from other collections. So they're becoming aware of what collection routes other companies are using, and they're effectively trying to get in ahead of the properly licensed collection and collecting their bags and taking their bags. Now, the third area is slightly more problematic, which is where fake charities or fake companies have been set up with the specific intention of misleading the public to donate to what can only be described as explicitly fraudulent collections. Now, we're in discussions with a number of our different partners within the sector, so the Textile Recycling Association, the Charity Retail Association, and we're going to be working with them over the course of the next year to see what more we can do to try and shut down some of these illegal and unlicensed clothing collections. So just to talk in a little bit more detail about some of the data that was provided to us by one of our members is, based on the data that was provided, we think somewhere between 2013 and 2016, 444 unlicensed collections may have taken place as opposed to 257 licensed collections for both clothing and household items. In total, this means that potentially 63% of all collections were unlicensed by local authorities or operating outside of the National Exemption Order scheme run by national government. In addition, the prevalence of theft has increased in recent years, with a number of operators seizing bags from rival operators, as I mentioned. And one of the main issues that has triggered some of this is that the rag price has risen. So that is effectively the price for second-hand clothing. So just to give you a bit more of an idea about why that happens, is that effectively when the rag price falls, this squeezes margins and leads to more undesirable activity, but equally when the rag price rises, that tends to draw in more illegitimate or illegal actors into the market who are looking to take advantage of the higher price. And just to give you an idea about how the rag price has moved over the course of this year, as you can see, there are three main determinants. This is textile banks, which is the blue line at the bottom, shop collections in red in the middle, and then delivered to the sorting plant, which is charity rags. And that will typically be those items, those products will generally be collected via door-to-door collections as well. So you can see there's significant variation in the price. Generally, the quality of the clothing donated via textile banks will be significantly lower than those collected from people's homes, which is one of the main reasons why you can see the differentiation in the price as well. So, as obviously for delivered to the sorting plant directly via direct debit, door-to-door collections, is that the price is almost up to £500 a tonne on the basis of September 2017 as well. So a significant rise over the course of the year, and one that has generally presented challenges. So the third area I'm going to be touching on today is peddlers and street traders, and that's effectively where these individuals are purporting to sell items for charity. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the difference between peddling and street traders, just to give you an idea of the main differences between the two. So peddlers are governed by I think it's the 1876 Peddler Act. This effectively provides licensing powers to the police as opposed to local authorities for either street trading or charity collections. And based on independent research conducted 2 years ago, we think somewhere between 3,000 and 4,500 peddlers are estimated to be operating in the UK. The peddler must be over 17 and must be residing in a particular area for at least 1 month prior to the application, and must be of good character and must in good faith intend to carry on the trade of a peddler. So a peddler is basically someone who trades as they travel. They should not remain stationary for longer than 10 minutes in any one location, and that is based on common law judgments passed by judges where individual local authorities have brought illegal street trading cases against peddlers, and those peddlers have contested the case. So there is a body of common law around what the nature and scope of peddlery is within the UK. However, what we have seen in recent years, unfortunately, is many peddlers and illegal street traders claiming that at least part of their proceeds go to charity. And on the previous slide, you may have seen one of the ubiquitous charity wristbands. That's a particular favourite of peddlers. Also key rings and newspapers and magazines, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But what we have seen is that these peddlers, is that many of them are purporting to collect money for the sale of charity items, but based on our contacts with local authorities, we think it's certainly highly questionable whether any sums are actually making their way through to the charities. And a particular issue is that simply there's no oversight of this particular regime. once you receive a peddling licence from a particular police force in a particular part of the country, you can work anywhere within the UK. The registers that are supposed to be kept by police forces is clearly not going to be a priority in the current climate. There's a lack of operational oversight and enforcement, and no real national oversight of what's actually happening within the sector. And I'll talk a little bit later on in the webinar about what we think we can do to try and improve what seems to be a significant area of weakness. In addition to the Peddlers Act, there's an additional piece of legislation, which is the 1982 Local Government Miscellaneous Provisions Act, and that provides an exemption from the street trading licensing regime, which is conducted by local authorities for both peddlers, which I've already touched on, but also news vendors. And it defines within that legislation what a news vendor is. But suffice to say that a number of companies have identified this gap or loophole in the licensing regime and are able to sell magazines on the street, which are positioned primarily as either benevolent or philanthropic endeavours, whereas we believe that the vast majority of those sums that many individuals believe they're donating for the purposes of buying a magazine are actually making their way through to the pockets of private entrepreneurs. Now, while we don't necessarily believe this is as widespread problem as either peddlery or other issues, and for example, the big issue is a good example about how this particular exemption has been used sensibly and to great benefit to society, we are concerned that there are some fringe organisations increasingly exploiting this loophole, and a number of local authorities have passed on to us cases where they think this is taking place within their area and their frustration about their lack of ability to implement any controls on these individuals. So just to give you a little bit more background about some of the other areas of street activity, and you'll obviously see a pattern here where, because a lot of the street activity is effectively ungoverned, unlike direct debit street fundraising, which is governed under partnership agreements between the Institute of Fundraising and local authorities, is that cash collections, while they are governed and licensed by local authorities, are governed under an incredibly old piece of legislation, the Police, Factories and Miscellaneous Provisions Act of 1916. And as you can see, they were originally the responsibility of local police forces, as is still the case for issuing peddler licences. But in 1972, as part of Ted Heath's local government modernisation and reorganisation agenda, those powers were transferred to district councils, and I'll talk a little bit later about why I think that's important. The other big change was that, particularly only within London for England, is that the Metropolitan Police have retained control over licensing, whereas in Scotland and Wales, as with the rest of England, licensing is for charity collections is a matter for licensing authorities, i.e. local councils. The only exception to that is Northern Ireland, where the police still issue licences for cash collections. So a particular challenge for cash collections, again, we think there are kind of three broad activities where there's cause for concern, which is genuine fundraisers collecting without a licence or knowledge of the charity concerned. This will typically be where well-meaning individuals who have no intention of defrauding anybody or taking significant sums from the proceeds of collections are fundraising, but without the prior authorisation or knowledge of charities. The second area is where genuine fundraisers are taking excessive amounts of expenses from the collection, and again, there's a particular issue here that I'll touch on in a second. And then the third, and obviously the most egregious, is fraudsters purporting to collect for real charities or creating fake charities, and we've seen a particular focus on military-based charities where they've been particularly susceptible to copycat fake charities who are effectively diverting money that would ordinarily, almost certainly, be going to those charities. So one of the issues that we've seen around genuine fundraisers taking excessive amounts of expenses is that while under the 1916 Act, it is illegal to pay those collecting cash on the street. They must be volunteers. Is that because the law does not apply to private property, is that what we have seen in recent years is a proliferation of companies who are offering cash collection services to predominantly smaller charities, so there would not be the larger household name charities who tend to have very active and well-supported regional networks of cash collecting volunteers across the country, is that these individuals are sometimes taking significant amounts of money from the collections directly, but they're also not explaining to the public that they are paid, effectively paid professional fundraisers. And the law is very clear. The 1992 Charities Act explicitly says that anyone who is a professional fundraiser has to provide what is called a solicitation statement to a potential donor, and that explains how much the company carrying out the fundraising activity is being paid and how that was being calculated, so i.e. the methodology, whether it's on a kind of per sign-up basis or some other form of remuneration for the professional fundraising company. But what we've got is effectively a loophole where certain organisations are effectively trying to bypass those laws, effectively because the law does not apply to private sites. So touching on the fifth main area, which is prize promotions and prize draws. So prize promotions are free of statutory regulatory control, and that's set out under the Gambling Act of 2005. And the reason for that is prize competitions, as opposed to lotteries and raffles, success depends at least in part on the exercise of skill, judgment or knowledge of the participants, and that's language that's drawn directly from the 2005 Act. However, a recent BBC programme identified that a particular fundraising agency, for example, was selling scratch cards with based very, very simple questions that were almost impossible to fail, and that they were also exempt from the solicitation statement to customers that I mentioned a few minutes ago. So under both areas, we believe they are effectively egregiously using loopholes in the legislation. They're purporting to be charity fundraisers. They're not explaining to individuals that they are paid, and they are effectively providing scratch cards and other kind of gambling products under the guise of a genuine prize promotions. Door-to-door lottery sales are a different matter. Those will generally be conducted by legitimate charities and legitimate companies on their behalf as well. However, a number of organisations do believe that lottery sales are outside the scope of what's called the House-to-House Collections Act of 1939, which primarily is connected to the provision of donations, which has effectively created a two-tier structure where we have some organisations who believe that the 39 Act applies to them and others that don't as well. So there's a degree of kind of tidying up and streamlining of the legislation that I think is long overdue. So just touching on how widespread we think this problem is, there are two main reporting bodies for charity fraud, Action Fraud and CIFAS. As you can see, for the last two reported years, we have seen a decrease in charity fraud. I think that is a welcome reflection of the additional investment that many organisations have made in their counter-fraud measures. Particularly data security over the course of the last 2 or 3 years has been a particularly priority for many organisations, and that's had some welcome secondary benefits in terms of shutting down some issues around charity fraud. But it's still clearly a significant issue, although we do believe the issue of fraud within public fundraising is significantly underreported. So moving on to the role of the Charity Commission and how the Institute of Fundraising works with the Charity Commission. As I say, we are talking today as a partner organisation of the Charity Commission. We're hugely supportive of the work that is being done by the Charities Against Fraud group. The Charity Commission obviously also covers a number of different areas around high fundraising costs, some of which will cover a number of the areas that I've covered in today's webinar. A really important piece of work that they've done in recent years is the quality of charity accounts, and one of the issues that's identified is that around 33% of accounts have explained the presence of high fundraising costs. So certainly in the way that campaigns are set up is that particularly in the early parts of a campaign is there will be very high fundraising costs, and clearly the expectation from both charities and agencies working on their behalf is those costs will fall as donors begin to be signed up. But it's really important that the Charity Commission, and we're very supportive of this, continues to take an overview of the way in which high fundraising costs are being described by charities to make sure that we're not seeing any particular charity being taken advantage of and paying significantly above market rate for fundraising services being provided. In 2015, as part of the same report, the Charity Commission identified that 15 cases had been investigated where the public were being exposed to either unregulated, unlawful or unauthorised fundraising, and some of the lessons learned within that about the particular types of fraud that was really being perpetrated by particular individuals. Certainly, we've circulated that information to members to make sure they're fully aware of the full nature of fraud within charity fundraising and learning from what's happening to other organisations. So, just coming to the end of the webinar now, what are some of the things that we feel at the Institute of Fundraising can be done to support counter-fraud measures? Well, the two-tier nature of local authority areas has been a particular challenge. I mentioned earlier the 1974 Local Government Act that transferred charity licensing responsibility to district councils. However, trading standards responsibilities around enforcement typically remain at county council level, although within unitaries, clearly those functions are within the same authority. But in county district areas, there is a particular challenge where we have district councils issuing licences for particular types of charity collections, but the responsibility for ensuring that consumers are protected from bogus door-to-door collectors or other forms of bogus street collection can often fall on county council staff. So we just need to make sure really that those organisations are working really closely, and we're working with both the Institute of Licensing and the Chartered Trading Standards Institute to make sure we can support both district and county councils to make sure they're fully aware of all the issues. The next big thing that we think is really necessary is setting up a better intelligence gathering network in partnership with local authorities, police and national fraud bodies to better collate data. As I mentioned, I think there is significant underreporting that is going on both from local authorities and from charities across the UK. A number of local authorities have expressed frustration about the lack of ability to centrally coordinate action, to alert other local authorities about where they're seeing particular fraudulent fundraisers who typically tend to operate on a circuit within particular areas. And certainly we're very keen to work with local authorities to make sure we can set up a better intelligence gathering and data collation network to make sure that we're sharing all we need to share to try and shut these people down. The third area that we think is there are significant numbers of loopholes that need to be shut down. So the legal loophole that allows peddlers to present themselves as charity fundraisers without a licence from the council, we believe should be changed, and that if a peddler is stating that any of the proceeds will go to charity, that should be governed, that should be covered by the local authorities' licensing powers, and therefore anyone operating and selling items that are purporting to be raising money for charitable, benevolent or philanthropic purposes would therefore fall within the remit of the council's licensing powers, and if they did not have a licence, they would effectively be a street trader and they could be prosecuted. Also, removing the legal loophole that street news fundraisers can present themselves as charity fundraisers without a licence from the local council. I believe there are significant carve-outs that we could make to make sure that big issue sellers and other legitimate news vendors are not unduly affected by this. But a number of operators on the street have clearly identified a loophole in the legislation where their local council is unable to control what they are able to do. One of the most straightforward things that we could potentially do is making sure that authorities outside of London have the same powers as in London. So a strange discrepancy that has arisen in recent years is that the London Local Authorities Act allows staff to seize goods being sold by illegal street traders, which is a significant deterrent to illegal street trading within London. That is not clearly to say that it solved the problem. There are ongoing significant illegal street trading issues, particularly within Westminster City Council's territory and other parts of London. But this particular power to seize the goods being sold by illegal street traders, we believe, should be expanded to cover other areas of the UK as well. And that could be done via a relatively straightforward amendment of the 1982 Local Government Act. So, a huge range of different issues that I've covered in today's webinar. I'll be speaking at the Charity Finance Group's conference in both London and Bristol on the 26th and 27th of October as well. I hope to see as many of you there as I can, and I'll be available for questions both during the formal and informal sessions afterwards as well. So I hope you found that a useful run through and overview of the key issues that I've identified in my 3.5 years in this role at the Institute of Fundraising. And if anybody needs to get in touch with the team based here at the IOF, you can go to our website, which is www.institute-of-fundraising.org.uk.